Motion to reselect Committee of Inquiry into Banking Crisis. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and on that question a division has been challenged. Shall our Stowe Senators Paul Cocktail and Aidan Hayden, Neil Senators Dermot Wilson and Ed O'Sullivan. Voting interval 1 minute commencing now.
Just as well as good carpet on the floor.
Yeah, I know that. He doesn't agree with the plan.
Taw 26, Neil 21. Senator Wilson.
Parliamentary Board Democracy Walkthrough. Thank you.
2 and 1. I hope you've all heard what White has said, you Labour senators. You might follow his lead. He doesn't agree with this.
Motion to select committee and inquiry into banking crisis. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and on that question the division has been challenged. Senators Dawson, Paul Coughlin and Eireann Hayden. Neil Senators Jim Wilson and Ed O'Sullivan. So walk through vote. To 26, Neil 22, the question is carried. Item number 2, report of the Committee of Selection to be taken without debate. Can I call on the last guy here to move the report to be laid before the Seanad?
That's my intention, but before I so do, I would like to have something clarified here in the record of the House. And I'm deeply hurt, offended and shocked by what the Taoiseach said in the other House concerning number 1. He made comments that has affected my credibility and my status as chairman of their committee, and furthermore has, in my view, undermined the Committee of Selection. What he said, in fact, I just want to put this on the record, he said some slick parliamentary footwork was performed, a parliamentary stroke was pulled, and that the Select Committee played political games, and that we should be ashamed of ourselves. And that accusation is to the Fianna Fáil members plus the 2 other members, Senator Bradford and Senator Norris. And I think this is an appalling statement, because just Just to put the record straight, I just want to put the record straight. On the week before we had the committee meeting of selection on the 4th of June.
Latitude to the chairman of the select committee.
Yeah, well I think it's an absolute slur on my character. It's a slur to the member of the select committee. What happened was a comedy of errors, and I've been very careful not to point any fingers at any person who was missing. I've been very careful to ensure that was done. But on the week before the 4th of June, on both Wednesday and Thursday, I was contacted at the request indirectly by the leader to hold a committee of selection as soon as possible, not to hold up the banking inquiry, and we agreed it would happen on the following week. So I rang the leader on the morning of the 4th and said, was it okay or was it an order to call a meeting? And he told me to proceed as soon as possible and have it that evening rather than postponing it further. So there was no political chicane, there was no straw pulled. There was a comedy of errors in events that happened. People turned up and voted in a particular way that I didn't, as chairman, anticipate. But for the Taoiseach to know to place on the record of Dáil Éireann, of which I was a member in the past, that there was a political strokes, but I want that corrected, and I would hope that the leader here today would acknowledge.
Since I have no control over that, and you have clarified the position. You have clarified the position.
Well, the leader will comment on it.
Is the motion agreed? The leader.
No, I haven't read the record, and yet I want clarification on that first point, maybe.
And I say what happens in the other house is a matter for the other house, but I can say that the government intend. If you could let me finish, please have a decency.
Have the leader without control. Have the leader without control.
Have decency and letting me finish.
I'm allowing latitude to the Lasker Hearlock and to the leader.
Can I say that the House here and we intend to support the democratic decision of the Committee of Selection. That's our position in the House.
I thank the leader for clarifying that, because it obviously undermines the rash comments made by the Taoiseach in the other House, which I think are most derogatory and defamatory, and brings my reputation and character as a long-serving member of this House and the other House into disrepute. So having that situation cleared, I want to say that the 17th report of the Committee of Selection took place on the 4th of June. The Committee of Selection reports that it has nominated the following members to serve on the Select Committee of Inquiry into the banking crisis: Senator Sean D. Barrett and Senator Mark McSharry. And I move that the report of the Select Committee that was held on the 4th of June be laid before the Seanad.
Is that agreed? Agreed. Agreed. Item number 3. Senators, I welcome to Seanad Eireann, Madame Anne Brasseur, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Our distinguished guest today is the first Luxembourger and only the second woman to take up the post of President of the Assembly. Madame Brasseur, I congratulate you on your election as President of the Parliamentary Assembly earlier this year. I know that the sessions you have already presided over have been eventful. This month's session will be no less so, with the election of a Secretary-General setting the scene for the work of the Council for the next 5 years. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which held its first session in 1949, can be considered the oldest international parliamentary assembly with a pluralistic composition of democratically elected members of Parliament established on the basis of an intergovernmental treaty. Ireland is a founding member state of the Council of Europe and is deeply committed to the principles and values which all members subscribe to on accession. Our own historical and more recent experience gives relevant background that we can draw on in debate and activities. I know that the Irish delegation attending the Council of Europe sessions on behalf of the Oireachtas are highly dedicated and participate fully in the plenary and committee meetings. The Parliamentary Assembly meets 4 times a year for week-long plenary sessions in Strasbourg. The 318 representatives and 318 substitutes are appointed by national parliaments from among their members. The Parliament of each country sends a delegation of between 2 and 18 representatives, depending on the country's population, which must reflect the balance of political forces in the Parliament. Under current rules, at least 1 representative must be a female. The Assembly is a unique platform for interparliamentary dialogue, communication and engagement, and is central to the Council of Europe's promotion of democracy, human rights and the rule of law. Given the great challenges that Ireland and Europe face, economic, financial, environmental and social, it is important that we continue to engage, exchange ideas and work together as democratic nations to resolve the issues that face us and foster a Europe that works in the interests of its citizens. In her role, President Brasseur plays an important role in helping to stimulate that dialogue. Today, we will have an opportunity to hear from President Brasseur on her vision and priorities for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. As you are aware, this Seanad, the future of which was recently endorsed by the people in a referendum, is determined to modernise its procedures and actively engage with civic society in its representative institutions. Our discussion today with President Brasseur is tangible evidence of that determination. On behalf of Seanad Eireann, I wish to thank Madame Brasseur for agreeing to appear before Seanad Eireann, and I would like to welcome you to the House, and we look forward to your presentation and a positive and enlightening discussion. Before I call on you, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Deputy Joe O'Reilly, who is the leader of the Irish group on the Council, and the work of Deputy Michael McNamara, Deputy Olivia Mitchell, Senator Jim Darcy, Senator Terry Layton, Senator Catherine Riley, and the former member of the House, Deirdre Clune, who is now MEP Clune, who do great work on the European Council. So you're very welcome, and I ask you to address the House.
Thank you very much, Eireann. Senators, I'm really very honoured to address today Seanad Eireann in this fine historic building, Leinster House. And it's in fact the first time that I'm addressing a parliament outside my own, and outside, of course, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So this is an honour for me, and thank you very much for this kind invitation. The Seanad has had and continues to have many illustrious members. While, and you know it better than I do, W.B. Yeats may be one of the most well-known, Senator Norris, currently a member of your esteemed institution, has a firm place in Strasbourg history as one of the successful early human rights litigants whose case has helped bring up major changes in laws and attitudes towards LGBT issues in Europe. The Irish are famed for their hospitality, their openness and friendliness. While I only started my official visit yesterday, already I feel at home in a country which has many similarities with my own country. Luxembourg has kept its own language, Luxembourgish. You have kept your own language, Gaelic. Both countries are cosmopolitan and open to diversity. But what makes me feel most at home is that your Seanad, made up of 60 members, is the same size as the Chamber of Deputies in Luxembourg. It is a great pleasure to be able to address you today on some of Europe's pressing political issues and the role and contribution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I also feel at home here today because Ireland is one of the great supporters of the ideals of the Council of Europe and its values based around rule of law, democracy and human rights. Support for these ideals is not to be taken for granted at a time of economic woes, political upheavals and troubling security issues. Ireland's commitment to the organization can be seen in many ways. The professionalism of its diplomats and experts in Strasbourg, the contribution of its parliamentarians under the chairmanship of Joseph Eireann, who is present here today, its involvement in campaigns such as those to combat domestic violence, child abuse, and trafficking of human beings, its application of the European Convention on Human Rights, and its cooperation with the monitoring bodies of the Council of Europe. Ireland has a unique and troubled history, which you have surmounted. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement gives hope and example of how to tackle and overcome frozen and other conflicts in Europe. As President of the Assembly, I cannot ignore these conflicts, and that is why the issue of conflict features strongly in my address. In Europe, there are plenty of conflict regions that deserve our attention, including Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, and the northern part of Cyprus. From your experience of conflict settlement, we can certainly benefit. One conflict which is already having a bearing on the whole of Europe is that between Ukraine and Russia. As I said last month in Vienna when addressing the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Council of Europe member states, the three most important challenges facing the Council of Europe today are Ukraine, Ukraine, and Ukraine. The conflict is a test for the credibility of our organization. It is also a test for our ability to support a member state facing an unprecedented political crisis, not only internally, but also at its borders. During the February 2014 Maidan events in Kiev, the rapporteurs of the Parliamentary Assembly's Monitoring Committee were on the square, providing daily updates on the situation. A week after Russia annexed Crimea, I visited Ukraine together with political leaders and rapporteurs. During this visit, we went to Donetsk in the east, which is now in the news, unfortunately, almost daily. While there, I met with the governor of the region in the administrative building currently occupied and sandbagged by so-called separatist forces. Back in March, there were already anti-government demonstrations, and a number of demonstrators chanted at me, Fascistskaya Europa. I don't understand Russian, but I understood those words. While the demonstrations at that time were peaceful, it also showed a level of frustration and distrust of Europe. Events in Ukraine, as you are well aware, moved quickly with the annexation of Crimea and the build-up of Russian troops at the border and the occupation of government buildings by the so-called separatists. The Parliamentary Assembly had to react. During the April part session, the Assembly sought to stand up for the values of the organization and took difficult and principled decisions which its founders would have expected of it. In Resolution 1988 on recent developments in Ukraine, the Assembly made it clear that Ukraine had a heavy responsibility, but also a window of opportunity to tackle corruption and bring about real constitutional change, electoral reform, decentralization, and a reform of the judiciary. This resolution was, however, overshadowed by discussions on Russia's annexation of Crimea and the increasingly worrying events in eastern Ukraine. Actions have consequences. In the Assembly, the consequences for Russia of their actions were laid out in Resolution 1990. I would like to be clear on what the Assembly decided, on what the Assembly did and did not do. Concerning the Russian delegation, we suspended voting rights. The possibility of being represented in the Bureau and Presidential Committee of the Assembly, that means the executive bodies, and the right to participate in election observations. It did not, however, suspend the credentials of the Russian delegation, thus allowing for an ongoing dialogue whereby the Russian delegation could continue to participate in the other work of the Assembly. Actions have again consequences. In the light of these sanctions by the Assembly, the Russian State Duma has reacted by, and I quote, suspending its further constructive participation in the PACE activities. It is unlikely that their parliamentarians will attend the June part session of the Assembly. Since these resolutions, the situation in Ukraine has not improved. On the contrary, the death toll has risen. There have been tragic events such as the fire and loss of life at the trade union building in Odessa. There have been allegations of atrocities, kidnappings, and hostage taking, and now there are daily military interventions. This cannot continue. A week ago, I spoke to the Speaker of the Russian State Duma, Mr. Narishkin, in order to see how channels of communication can be kept open, because we need channels of communication with a view to bringing an end to the violence. While these discussions were frank and open, I cannot say there was much progress, apart from an agreement to meet and talk in the future. Ukraine may be Europe's Pandora's box, but as we know and as we hope, at the bottom of the box, there is hope. With the election of a new president in Ukraine, Mr. Poroshenko, there are prospects that he will be able to forge a dialogue with Russia and the separatists in the east. On the home front, he has a mandate to build on the reform process, which I have already mentioned. I have invited President Poroshenko to address the Assembly at the end of the month in Strasbourg, and I hope he will be able to come. This conflict will certainly challenge our conflict settlement skills. Your parliamentarians, with their experience, have something to contribute in the future discussions on this issue. Perhaps we also can learn from James Joyce. Your battles inspired me, not the obvious material battles, but those that were fought and won behind your forehead. There are other major challenges for Europe. The financial and economic crisis is one of these, and Ireland has shown courage in tackling its problems and building trust in its financial institutions. This has not come without a political cost and, above all, a tremendously personal cost to many Irish men and women through tremendous efforts and sacrifices. Across Europe, the financial and economic crisis have also engendered a social crisis. It is therefore essential that fundamental social rights, such as those under the European Social Charter, are respected in difficult times, in particular for those most vulnerable. Senators, While Ireland may in many ways be a model member state, there are, and I have to say it, there are still steps it can take. In the recent report on the state of democracy, human rights and the rule of law in Europe, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe highlighted that Ireland needs to consider ratifying or signing 7 further conventions. Here I would particularly mention the convention concerning sexual abuse on children, the Lanzarote Convention, the Convention tackling domestic violence, the Istanbul Convention, Protocol 12 of the European Convention on Human Rights relating to non-discrimination, and conventions concerning money laundering and cybercrime. The relevance of these conventions I do not need to explain. In terms of the other conventions ratified by Ireland, the spirit of cooperation of your authorities is to be welcomed. It is nonetheless important that recommendations from these bodies are fully implemented, whether they concern migrants with the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, detainees with the reports of the European Committee for Prevention of Torture, Irish travellers in the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, or other vulnerable groups or issues under other mechanisms. One of the priorities for my presidency is to help member states live up to their commitments under the European Convention on Human Rights, and not to patronize, but to help, as we all are helping all countries in order to live up with their commitments. If all countries could show Ireland's level of commitment, Europe would be Europe would be a better place. Before the court, you have a reputation of being willing to do business. This means settling cases where appropriate and fighting hard on cases where most important issues of principle are concerned. This is the way it should be. You have relatively few cases. This is not luck. It is because the European Convention on Human Rights is well rooted in your domestic law and strengthened further by the incorporation of the Convention into domestic law in 2003. I would like to refer to the difficult and sensitive issue of abortion and how the Seanad and the Dáil handled this in the light of the A, B and C judgment against Ireland. Both houses organized in the Seanad a hearing over several days collecting evidence from different parties and sectors with a view to preparing legislation. This is a model of parliamentary cooperation and engagement in order to bring domestic law into conformity with the European Convention on Human Rights. Notwithstanding that Ireland has had to deal with judgments of extreme sensitivity, this has been done without a backlash against the Convention and the Court. The country has taken its international obligations seriously and has not sought a pick-and-choose approach to human rights, because in human rights you can't just practice pick and choose. Furthermore, Ireland has also been highly supportive of the European Court in other ways, including by funding for the benefit of all webcasting of hearings before the Court. If, however, I may make one suggestion, it would be for you to consider inviting your government agent and your Attorney General to speak to both houses once a year on the implications of case law developments for Irish law and practice. Senators, I was pleased to learn that after the recent referendum in Ireland, the future of the Seanad is no longer in question. In preparing for the visit, I came across an article published a few years ago. In this, the author spoke about those who wanted the Seanad to go away and said of these people, these, and I quote, are the bores of the world, the monotony monitors who travel the four corners of the globe seeking out remaining pockets of individuality and interestingness to be standardized into boredom or else abolished. End of quote. I hope none of us will be standardized into boredom and that pockets of individuality and interestingness will continue. Senators, to conclude, Gawim, Boechus, Livgolar, Uson, Eshtort, Aruk, Shivdum.
Just on a procedural matter there, Cathaoirleach, could I propose that we would conclude this item? I know Madam Brasseur has a very tight schedule. We will conclude this item at 1:40, and that item 4 be taken at 1:40.
Agreed? Agreed. Senator Jim Darcy.
Michael de Cathaoirleach, Madame Brasseur, bonjour et nous vous remercions beaucoup pour votre visite. It is a great pleasure to welcome you, Madame Brasseur, to Ireland. Since your election as President in January of this year, you have been outstanding in that role. In particular, your handling of the difficult debates on the Ukraine, and particularly the debates on possible sanctions on Russia, was excellent. The situation as regards Russia and its Ukrainian policy is a big issue, and the Council of Europe, as the principal human rights and democracy body in the wider Europe, has a very important role, and we have 47 countries in the Council of Europe. It places an enormous responsibility on the Parliamentary Assembly to be the voice of reason in this whole debate. And I am pleased that whereas certain voting rights were taken from the Russian delegation, the option of expelling Russia or cancelling its credentials was rejected. It is very important that communication is kept open with Russia, and the Council of Europe is one of the few organisations where East meets West. I urge you to continue dialogue with the Duma members of PACE and to continue with your contacts at ambassadorial level. Anything we, the Irish members of PACE, and I'm delighted that our leader, Joe O'Reilly, is here today, and with his input into the Council of Europe, hopefully someday we will be proposing Joe O'Reilly for the President's job, but that is in the future. The Ukraine is a very sad situation at the present time. There are some recent signs of movement, if not improvement. Hopefully this will bear fruit and conflict can be avoided. Could I just say briefly in relation to Azerbaijan that there have been some concerns about human rights issues in that country. It is very important that these concerns be addressed, particularly as the question arises with the chairmanship of Azerbaijan of the Ministerial Council. I know that you are using your good offices in this regard. Madame Brasseur, since being appointed to the Council of Europe, I have had the privilege to attend plenary sessions and last week the meeting of the Culture, Education, Media and Science Committee in Paris. At that meeting we discussed a number of issues, including a report from Mr. Peter Wach from Poland on the raising of the status of vocational education and training. This is an issue dear to our hearts, and recently in Ireland we have had legislation in this regard, including the Education and Training Boards Bill and the Bill on Further Education and Training, establishing a new and better delivery structure. We need constantly to monitor this education so our people throughout Europe get the best possible training and education. These people are the backbone of our country. I know as a former education minister in your native Luxembourg, you have always had a deep interest and concern in relation to vocational education and training. And I encourage you particularly to support the resolution, the report of Mr. Wack, as it goes through its different stages. Now, finally, could I say that when the Council of Europe was set up in 1949, Ireland was a founder member. Yesterday, I had lunch with the grandson of the Taoiseach of the time, John A. Costello, who said that, the grandson said that Taoiseach Costello considered it one of his most important achievements to bring Ireland into the Council of Europe as a founding member. I have absolute confidence in your ability to lead the Council of Europe through all the amazing directions in which it is going at the present time, and assure you once again of our full committed support.
Senator Mooney.
I'm very honoured on behalf of the Fianna Fáil group to welcome you here to the upper houses of the Irish Parliament, and to say that it's a historic day not only for us but obviously for yourself, as you outlined, that you are addressing a full Parliament in your tenure, during your tenure as President. As has already been outlined, Ireland has a very proud history and tradition of participation in the Council of Europe as a founder member, and I couldn't help but reflect on the circumstances in which the Council of Europe came together in 1949 in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where human rights had been trampled on, where the whole concept of human rights was something that had not been developed at all. And it is to the credit of those founding fathers that they set down concepts at that time which have resonated to the present day. And it's in that context that I was particularly interested in your remarks about the relationship between the Council of Europe and Russia. And I applaud your efforts in that regard. It is, as you have outlined, I think you've probably been somewhat restrained, one of the most serious crises to affect Europe since the Second World War. And I'd be curious to know how you think that this is going to develop over the coming weeks and months. The fact that you've invited the newly elected President of the Ukraine to address the Parliamentary Assembly, I think, is worthwhile. There seems to be some movement between Russia and the Ukraine in this regard in terms of trying to lessen tensions. But I would be curious to know what your overall view, as someone who has been pivotal to the discussions and all the developments over the last few months. Another aspect of the, by the way, could I just say in relation to Russia and the Council, I'm particularly pleased that the Parliamentary Assembly stopped short of withdrawing the credentials of the Russian members, because I think it's very, very important that dialogue continue. I think it was Churchill that used that particular phrase about it was better to jaw than war. And in that sense, because I think as Senator Darcy has said, it is one of the few Europe-wide organisations in which East and West come together. And I know from my own period of time, I was a member of the Council of Europe from 2002 until 2008, I know that Russia continued to play a very active role within the Council of Europe. They saw it as being a very important connection to the rest of Europe. So I would think that they themselves would not wish to do anything that would endanger their status in that regard. But it's particularly pleasing, I think, that while putting forward a marker in terms of the sanctions that you did impose, that you stopped short of withdrawing credentials. I don't think that would have solved anything, and I think it was a very wise decision. Another aspect of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly is, do you have any views on its future role? Because I know that this has been a matter that has been under discussion for some years, particularly since 2004 with the enlargement of the European Union. There were many of the countries, the former Soviet satellite countries, who saw the Council of Europe as being the most important part of their external policy, and who were very active members of it, but who have since joining the European Union. I remember in the latter years and certainly in the initial years from 2004 to 2008, getting the impression that there was less participation, or that there was less commitment from those countries to the Council of Europe, simply because they had now become members of the wider European Union. And I do know that the European Union themselves, maybe they've stopped it now, but there certainly was a view within the member states of the European Union that was there a need for an assembly? Was there a need for a Council of Europe? After all, the European Union was founded on the same concepts of human rights and equality and fairness to all. So I'd be curious to know what the relationship is now between the Council of Europe and the European Union. And finally, in the question I'm putting to you about the evolving situation in the Ukraine, I'm sure you will agree with me that it has made other countries very nervous of what has happened and Russian involvement in the Ukrainian crisis, particularly neighbouring countries. For example, the disputed territories in Moldova and the others, that Transnistria and the Nagorno-Karabakh that you mentioned, whether you believe that there is a need to be more concerned about those situations than perhaps heretofore. But once again, I welcome you to the House, welcome you to Ireland. I'm glad that you've had an enjoyable time here, and I hope that you'll come back among us sometime soon.
Mr. Bacic.
I think I'll let Senator Quinn go ahead. I think he's under time.
I appreciate that very much indeed. Madam President, you're very welcome here, and thank you indeed for your address. You've opened our eyes, some of us, and I'm one of them, who didn't know a great deal about the Council of Europe. Other members here, including Deputy O'Reilly and Senator Mooney, have had a lot of experience of it. You've opened our eyes, you've told us a great deal about it. May I just give you the opportunity to add a little bit to it? Could you give me a brief overview of, say, the 5 achievements of the Parliamentary Assembly in the past year? I know Russia is going to play a very large part on that, and I can understand that the crisis in Ukraine must put huge pressure on the Council of Europe. And is there this lack of trust that I think must develop now between Russia and Ukraine, and therefore is that going to damage the Council of Europe? And if Russia withdraws its €23 million contribution, I know it hasn't done yet as far as I know, but will that result in the Council being unable to function as competently as it has in the past? The other area where Ireland has been involved is in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's the OSCE. And I understand they have several hundred people involved in the Ukraine crisis. Is there a danger that the Council of Europe is going to almost overlap, or is it going to benefit the work that's being done on that basis? I know on that rise. Could you also just give me some sort of view on the rise of extremism in Europe? It's a concern for everybody. It's not the same rise of extremism in every case, but there are some countries that have moved very strongly right and some that are moving to the left. Do you believe that there's something that we can learn from that, and is there anything else that we can work on that basis? And can you comment on where the Assembly sees major deficits in our legislation here in Ireland, or in Irish society in general? From your perspective as President, what should be our focus as legislators? What should we be doing perhaps differently than we're doing at the moment? You're very welcome. Thank you for giving us such an insight. I'm sorry if I'm not here for the next few minutes, but I hope to be back to hear your answers. Thank you.
Senator Van Tornout.
Thank you very much. I stand here as an independent senator, but I too would like to welcome you to the Senate and say welcome, bienvenue. My background is actually in children's rights, and I've been a long time admirer of the Council of Europe and its work. In fact, my first experience was probably about 25 years ago with the Youth Directorate as it was then, but the Youth Department now of the Council of Europe, and the trainings that it does for future youth leaders. And I do want to encourage and thank the Council of Europe for that, because I was introduced, and it's excellent to see that it still continues to this day, that in the area of youth policy, that you have a system of co-management, where youth NGOs sit down with government to, or with the officials of the member states to determine the budgets and the programs for young people. And I think many member states could maybe draw reference from the success that the Council of Europe has shown of actually being able to sit at the table with those who you are funding and reach democratic decisions. And certainly on that, I would like to very much commend the Council of Europe and the work I know that the Parliamentary Assembly has placed on developing on children's rights. If we look at building a Europe for and with the children, certainly a forerunner to much of the work that we have seen happening at EU level. If we look at the work on children in care, child-friendly justice, that's an area that the EU still has not yet. The EU is taken from a very protectionist side, in my opinion, on justice, and I think the work of the Council of Europe on child-friendly justice is remarkable and is something I certainly, in my work here in the Seanad, draw reference from on a regular basis. And I suppose I'm also very happy that we have experts such as Ursula Kilkelly playing a leading role in that work within the Council of Europe. And you've mentioned the work on the domestic violence and child abuse, the importance of Ireland ratifying the Lanzarote Convention, the Istanbul Convention, amongst others. And I certainly think we do need to live up to our roles. Because Senator Mooney rightly asked, and I think it is a question, and I think this is one of the bonuses of having a debate like this today with you, Madam President, is to talk about what is the future of the Council of Europe, what is the role that the Parliamentary Assembly can play. Certainly for me in my work, I have seen all too often what actually happens is the Council of Europe is a very good place to debate, to discuss, from youth policy to children's rights to child-friendly justice, the areas of domestic violence. And it's many, many years later that we then see the EU starting to pick up and understand. But very often it's in a pick and mix way, and not with the integrity that the Council of Europe has developed it. But I certainly would echo, I think what Senator Mooney asked, it's something that I'm trying to think through myself, and I think it's something perhaps as a House we should also be talking and contributing to, and not just be bystanders. As parliamentarians, we have a role to support our colleagues who are representing us in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And finally, I would like to thank you for starting with your acknowledgement of our colleague Senator David Norris. I think you remind us actually how proud to be of the role that he played. You know, sometimes when you're sitting with a figure of such, that he has done something of such historic importance, and that he used so positively the European Convention on Human Rights. And that for me is something that we should all continue to draw reference from, and actually say, are there other areas as Ireland that instead of just being followers, maybe we can be leaders and take direction. So thank you very much for your visit.
Patrick.
And President Brasseur, you're very welcome. Ta fáilte rogad.